I saw a billboard driving through Georgia, and essentially the billboard said universe of, 13.5 billion years old that came from nothing, or God created the universe according to the Bible. Both require faith. That's a billboard. Like somebody paid a lot of money to put religion and science on the same level. And I saw another billboard with a similar sentiment of like that science is religion. And this is a concept that people have brought to me before, like the idea, well, science is just another religion, and so everything requires faith. Doesn't it make so much more sense that there's a creator that started everything and the creator is eternal, as opposed to the unknown or the universe being eternal? Yeah. So when you hear that, is that a familiar sentiment to you? The idea that science is religion? And if so, how do you think about that?
That is definitely a familiar concept to me. I've had people say that to me personally, and it's things I've come across in my readings and stuff like that. And you know, it's it's an interesting idea. I think it's worth grappling with, thinking about the ways in which that may or may not be true, uh, because you know a lot of people think that, and I think a lot of more scientifically minded people just kind of dismiss it out of hand, like, no, science isn't faith. And I think it's worth diving into deeper than that and thinking about, if it's not like faith, how is it not like faith? And what do we even mean when we say that something is faith-based, or if something is a religion? If science is a religion, how are we defining religion? If it takes faith to believe something that science tells us is true, what do we mean by faith? And the difficulty with some of that is that there are a lot of different definitions of both religion and faith. And some definitions of religion and some definitions of faith are more or less compatible with what we want science to be and what we want science to do. Um, but broadly speaking, when people say that whether you believe in the Christian Bible or whether you believe in evolution and cosmology and physics, they both require faith. I think at its heart, what's happening here is a false equivalency. I think that there are substantial differences between them, and I think those differences are meaningful. Well, kind of regardless of how you define faith or religion, I think that there's significant and substantial differences between religious faith and science or scientific doctrine and things like that. And we can get into the nitty gritty of those, but I know that this is definitely something that you've grappled with, both as an apologist for that view and now as someone who would criticize that view. So I'm curious how you might define faith, religion, and grapple with someone who's making that kind of false equivalency.
So, one of the first things that I think about is that there are people from a lot of different religions that all practice science. And so it doesn't seem to me that there's a choice that they have to make between their religious views and their scientific endeavors. And so, just on the face value there, it doesn't seem to be incompatible with all of those people, because I would say probably most scientists, if there's anything close to the numbers that we see, at least here in the US, most scientists believe in God. And the thought that science is then competing with religion, it holds a little less water when science includes a lot of people of a lot of faiths, and a lot of different perspectives. And the other thought I had was, when somebody makes the claim, the Bible versus science, they're making a really big claim that there's a single perspective on the Bible. And so one thing that changed for me was realizing that there's a lot of interpretations of the Bible that are even compatible with a scientific understanding of the origins of the universe. So when somebody says, it's either 13.5 billion years old or the Bible, it's actually a really narrow view of the Bible that they're assuming. And then they're projecting that on as like the only way to interpret it. So I think a big error that people make when saying something like that is their interpretation of the Bible. They're replacing what the Bible is in its historical context and the purpose for, it's the peoples that it was referencing and the written to, about, and to. And so there's that context of, well, that's actually a really specific, narrow understanding of the Bible. The idea of, like, for instance, young Earth creationism or 6-day creation, and that's not even what I think most Christians would view the Bible as. So there's a few different things there that my mind hops through when I see something like that.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's super interesting. It immediately makes me think of some of the debates that I ran into many years ago when I was first kind of diving into the anti-theist literature of like Dawkins and Harris and stuff like that. But I remember Dawkins had an ongoing beef with another evolutionary biologist named Stephen Jay Gould. Are you familiar with him?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So they had ongoing beefs about a few different things, including concepts in evolutionary biology like punctuated equilibrium. But they also had very differing opinions on what the role was of science kind of versus religion. To what extent did they like conflict with each other? And Stephen Jay Gould had a famous concept where he called religion and science non-overlapping magisteria. He basically said that like science is giving us information about what the world is like, and religion is doing something different. And these need not compete with each other. They don't inherently overlap with each other. They don't need to be enemies. And Dawkins famously rejects that. He says that religion, especially the Abrahamic traditions, but religion in general, is making metaphysical claims. It's making claims about the nature of reality, and that is the realm of science. And insofar as religion tells us aspects of the nature of reality, it kind of inevitably bumps into the realm of science. And sometimes it won't conflict with science, and sometimes it will. But regardless of when it does and doesn't, we need to give priority to what science says. And so in that way, science is kind of the enemy of religion, and religion can't help but to move into the realm of science because of its tendency to make claims about the nature of reality. I don't personally feel too strongly about either one of those. I think I'm probably more these days. I think I'm probably more in the Gould camp than the Dawkins camp in terms of I don't think that they're inherently in conflict with each other. And like what you were touching on, there's such a wide range of religious viewpoints and religious traditions. I mean, there's as many religious traditions as there are religious people, basically. And I think that that's problematic to just say that there's something inherently in conflict with all those people's beliefs from a scientific perspective. But again, I can't help that in these conversations, it makes me immediately wonder, like, what do we even mean when we say religion? So do you have like a definition of religion that, how do you go about defining the concept of religion?
Right. let's go ahead and I'm going to pull up a definition of religion
Okay.
because fortunately we're not the first to have to struggle through this. So we can do a Wikipedia definition. We can do a Merriam-Webster definition of the word. Let's do Merriam-Webster.
Okay.
All right. Religion, noun. One definition is a personal set or institutionalized system of religious attitudes, beliefs, and practices. That's not super helpful to me because it is self-referential.
Yep.
Two, the service and worship of God or the supernatural, or a commitment or devotion to religious faith or observance. Again, self-referential, not super helpful. But that first one, that's like it's defining it as a service and worship of God. So there has to be God or the supernatural involved. Other definition, a cause, principle, or system of beliefs held to with ardor and faith. And so that one starts opening up a little bit closer to, so I have the idea that people can hold scientific understandings with a religious fervor. Like, I think it's possible that just as humans, we are drawn to whatever the benefits are of religion. And I think human scientists are drawn to some of those same things, like this feeling of understanding enough to feel in control, understanding the future, being able to predict what's going to happen. So I think you can always have people who can turn anything into a religion. I don't think science is immune from that. Um, and that's where we get into with definition three. What I do think is that science over the long term is inherently self-correcting in a way that at least some religious systems are not. Because religion comes down to interpretation of usually some sort of religious text or something that has you can interpret it a lot of different ways. This broad spectrum of interpretations are easily applied. And while you do have interpretation in science, you are constantly gathering new information and slowly adjusting the paradigm or shifting the paradigm. And like the new explanation completely includes and explains your previous information and then adds on to it. So that's why we can still live in the world of Newton and the world of Einstein and live in the next world after that, because whoever comes up with a theory of everything, we can also live in their world, and all the other ideas, the fundamental ideas, tend to still be compatible because we can still teach and understand Newton's laws of physics. It's just he had a lower resolution view. And as we've learned more and had a paradigm shift and have more information, Newton's laws didn't just stop working. And so science has something to it where like the practice of science as a thing seems to have something inherently built into it, an inherent skepticism, first and foremost, that sometimes people can attach and misplace faith in, whereas religion has an inherent faith requirement that often when those in it are skeptical, they get kicked out. And I think that's a pretty stark difference.
Yeah, I want to think of science that way. But if you will grant me, I'd like to complicate that story just a little bit with some philosophy of
Please.
science.
Yeah.
Um, so in philosophy of science, there's a few different ways of conceptualizing what we even mean by science, and more specifically, how we differentiate science from pseudoscience. In the world of philosophy of science, that's called the demarcation problem. How do we demarcate science from pseudoscience? How do we draw that line? And the person who is probably most famously associated with it in the 20th century is Karl Popper. Are you familiar with him at all?
A little, yeah.
Yeah. So he's very famous for coining the concept of falsification. Falsificationism, which was his proposed way of differentiating science from pseudoscience. So if you want to know what science does differently than than religion and various other pseudosciences, look to falsification. Science as a project is inherently trying to contradict itself. It's trying to find the ways in which it's wrong. And like you were saying, it has this kind of built-in corrective aspect to it through its process of falsification. Um, and Karl Popper, famously contrasted physics with Marxism and Freudian psychoanalysis and a couple of other fields of inquiry, where he said that these are inherently pseudoscientific because they function in a non-falsifiable manner. They
Hmm.
are essentially able to incorporate any sort of conflicting evidence that you throw at it. A Marxist view of history or a Freudian psychoanalysis perspective on like individual trauma or whatever, there's no way that you can like prove them wrong, and whatever you bring up to contradict it, it's like, well, that actually works really well with the theory ad infinitum. Like there's nothing that could like prove either of them wrong, according to Popper. And he said, contrast that with Einstein's approach to general relativity, when they were famously able to test the predictions that general relativity was making in, I think, 1919 with a solar eclipse, where there were these really close mathematical predictions being made at how much the sunlight would bend when they actually looked up
Yeah,
at
would you be
the
able to see the stars that are actually behind the sun because of the gravitational changes that the mass creates?
exactly. And they were very fine-tuned predictions. According to Popper, he spoke specifically about this example. These were falsifiable predictions. If we made the measurements and they didn't show up, then Einstein was wrong, and we figure that out. We move on. It's making falsifiable predictions. And so for Popper, that's what science is. It's falsifiable. And then the story got complicated. And a fella named Thomas Kuhn comes onto the scene in the mid 20th century. And he comes up with the concept of scientific paradigms, which I'm sure you're familiar with. And he says, these very like Popper has this like kind of like idealistic, fancy schmancy way of solving the demarcation problem. But rather than just speculating about what science is or what it ought to be, let's actually look like sociologically, what are scientists doing? We can say all day what science is supposed to do or what its theories claim, but what do scientists on a day-to-day basis actually do? And Thomas Kuhn said that what science does in practice is actually extremely conservative. It functions within a paradigm and accepts the wide-ranging contours of that paradigm wholesale, and then explores different aspects of that paradigm within the paradigm on a day-to-day basis. And it's not until basically by accident or like random circumstance that there's a few things that start to push against the boundaries of that paradigm until there's a tipping point and there's a paradigm shift. Um, but science in practice, the majority of the time, accepts without question the major worldview assumptions of that paradigm. And it is not in the business of falsifying, it's actually in the business of reifying, of making real the existing paradigm, building out structures that kind of reinforce that existing paradigm. And even when paradigms shift and we find ourselves in a new paradigm, like the one that you mentioned, the move from the Newtonian paradigm to the Einsteinian paradigm, even when that happens, for Kuhn, he's saying that's not bringing us closer to truth. It's just moving us from one paradigm to another. And that tipping point, that move, takes a ton. It's incredibly difficult to do, and the overwhelming majority of science is not pushing against the boundaries of that paradigm. And even when we do move, it's not necessarily bringing us closer to truth. And those two dudes, Popper and Kuhn, kind of set the poles for the major debate around the demarcation problem through the 20th century. And there's been a lot of moves since then. But it's really interesting because, it complicates the idea that fundamentally science is anything. Because really, what is science outside of the ways that practitioners do it? And if we as human apes are so kind of like entrenched in our biases and the sociological systems and all of that, that our ability to actually try to falsify anything is really, really limited, then I think it calls into question the idea that science is fundamentally falsifiable. And even Kuhn even famously pushed back against the famous example of Einstein. Okay, so Popper said he was making falsifiable predictions with the solar eclipse. Kuhn says, actually, he wasn't, because even if we found evidence that wasn't right, we wouldn't have rejected Einstein's theory. We would have looked to what he called auxiliary hypotheses, these other potential explanations that would have allowed us to make sense of why the predictions were wrong. And oftentimes that's a really important thing to do. We don't want to just throw out the baby with the bathwater every single time that we get something that contradicts our experiments. And we see that all the time these days, where there's headlines that say, recent cosmological discovery calls into question our entire understanding of the universe. And every time that happens, we're not like, well, quantum physics is wrong. Well, Einstein is wrong. We're trying to make sense of how that can square with our understanding of quantum physics or Einsteinian relativity or whatever. And the same thing would have happened with the solar eclipse measurements. We would have said maybe the telescope was wrong. Maybe the lens was slightly warped. Maybe this, maybe that, and those are all auxiliary hypotheses that, according to Kuhn, would have functioned to prevent us from actually falsifying the theory.
Hmm.
So anyway, that's some philosophy of science for you.
Yeah. That is intriguing, and it does complicate things. And it is my experience that no matter which direction I learn more in, one of the tenets is it gets more complicated in general, not less, because there's been so many people thinking so many things. So what do you think of Kuhn when he makes the claim that we would have done something differently?
I like Popper and Kuhn, and I think that they bring up a lot of good points. I think Kuhn is right, because I think we can look to the way that we do science on a day-to-day basis, and it seems to kind of confirm what he was saying. But I don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing. I think that's just a reality of, what would science look like? How could we even achieve progress if every single scientist was only doing work that was trying to question and challenge the fundamental tenets of our understanding of physics or biology, or you know what I mean? Like, what if every evolutionary biologist, rather than doing the incredibly arcane, obscure, minutia scientific experiments that they're doing on, like South American jewel beetles or something, rather than doing things like that, if every single evolutionary biologist was only trying to question Darwinian evolution and push
Sure.
us outside of that paradigm,
So
that
is
doesn't
that,
seem.
sorry to interrupt, but I just want to jump in quick to ask, it sounds like maybe when you're talking about falsification, um, does falsification have to be at that scale in order for it to be a part of science? Is
Mm,
falsification just that, oh, they're falsifying Darwinian evolution, or could it be that within the minutia of their tiny experiment, what they're also looking for are the ways that they could be wrong within that? Like falsification sounds like something that doesn't necessarily have to be at the paradigm shift level.
yeah, that's a great point. And I think that what you just said there can allow for science to still have that kind of corrective aspect kind of built into it. Even though Kuhn was pretty skeptical of that, and I think there's reason to be skeptical of that on an individual level, like psychologically, to what extent we're actually very effective at trying to falsify anything that we're doing. I think that when we zoom out and see things from kind of a more institutional or systemic lens, I think that there's a lot of little pieces of falsification happening all the time, and that could lead to some pretty fascinating aggregate results. That's kind of my personal take on it. But yeah, I mean, there's you know there's we see both both things happening all the time in practice in science. We see scientists working really rigorously to potentially falsify their findings, and they do really good practices with their data analysis and their predictions and things that and their p values to show to what extent something might or might not be right or wrong, and those are really effective scientific practices. And then you have scientists all the time in practice not doing those things. And even we've seen some mainstream instances recently of scientists fudging the data. And there's fascinating ways to fudge the data that are perfectly acceptable within the academy. And we have a really loose standard of p-values in psychology that's led to a replicability crisis and all of this kind of stuff, where immediately it kind of raises the question as to what extent science is a thing versus to what extent science is kind of the aggregate of a bunch of individual actions. And if it's the latter, then there are some people who are really working hard to falsify things, and there are some people working really hard to do the exact opposite and to prove themselves right and to find the conclusions that they already held at the outset, or to get conclusions that will help them flourish, and get tenure and get funding and get books published,
Yeah,
things like that.
yeah. Um, it also seems that in order to see that that's happening or even know that's happening, there has to be some application of scientific method, because there's like, hey, we have this aggregate, how many papers that are coming in, and based on some statistical analysis, sometimes you can tell it's like, oh, it is obvious that we can't tell the specifics, but it's obvious that as a group, some papers are not, they're just, there's something off in the data. Like the way that it has been manipulated can actually show up like a fingerprint in some statistical analysis, which is why we even know that there's a problem. So it's like that's that kind of self-correcting, self-healing aspect of science in my mind that's coming right back into play, because it is actually, it is critical of itself, and it is checking on itself. And I think the argument could be made, well, in religion, people change their minds as well. But then I know, like from Dawkins and that sort of that type of mindset, the argument is, well, as soon as you start applying scientific principles, the type of thinking that science brings us is when you start applying that to religion, then that's when people start changing their minds. Where before science was on the scene, the only option you had for religion was to believe an authority structure. And in science, while the authority structure does exist, it is possible for a patent clerk to disrupt it with something that is testable. And so I still do see like a difference between science and religion.
Yeah, yeah, me too. But it is difficult to pin down exactly what those differences are. I've been asking this question of people, including myself recently, of what beliefs do I hold that I would be unwilling to change regardless of argument or evidence? Are there certain things that I take true about the world that I simply won't budge on? And I think that that's a really important question for all of us to ask ourselves. I don't know to what extent we will be very effective at being able to identify them, even if we hold them, but I think it's worth interrogating that in ourselves. And I think the the willingness or even eagerness to change our beliefs in light of good evidence and good argument is what I like to consider a scientific attitude. And that's an attitude that I think is not exclusive to science. And plenty of religious people can hold it, and plenty of religious people can even hold it about their religious ideas. But I think science as a project does flourish really effectively, and even itself fosters that kind of scientific attitude, an eagerness to find ways in which we're wrong and to change our beliefs because of changing evidence and changing argument. Um, but but that's no easy feat. And of course, as a philosophy-minded person, it immediately rings some alarm bells in my head. Like, for instance, what do you mean by evidence? And
Right.
that gets into some sticky territories in terms of how to even define evidence and what qualifies as good evidence, which is a different question, but an important one.
Totally makes sense. Why everything, once we get into it, can be complicated and hard to understand.
It's also messy.
It's messy. Yeah.
Yeah. I will say that I'll say this too. One of my good friends is getting his doctorate in religious studies. Okay, he is an atheist who is getting his PhD in religious studies and works at a pretty religious school, and he's studying Buddhism. And as a result, he's a little bit of an outsider because obviously a lot of people there it's like connected to a seminary school, and a lot of people there are studying Christianity specifically, but the Abrahamic traditions more broadly. And he's an atheist who's studying Buddhism. But he said that in a lot of the courses he took, there was this kind of ongoing sense of like, how can we understand what religion is in a like charitable way? If we want to define religion, how can we do so in a way that does justice to the people who are actually religious, and not providing a definition that just kind of, is flippant or dismissive toward the intensity of people's religious beliefs and their spirituality and their feelings and things like that, but offering up a definition of religion that they themselves probably accept. And the definition that he promoted that I liked a lot in terms of because I want to find connection with religious people and people generally, and I don't want to sow divides and sow discord and stuff like that. So his definition of religion is that it is traditions and communities connected through projects of meaning making. And if I accept that as a definition of religion, if that's my starting point as to what religion is, then boy howdy, is there a lot of overlap with what I want in life and what I want to do and what I find important. And as opposed to if I take some of the definitions like the ones that you were reading from Merriam-Webster or some of the popular ones that, Dawkins and Harris and Hitchens and stuff will promote, which are like dogmatic beliefs in a deity or dogmatic adherence to the supernatural and things like that. When they're defined in that way, then, of course it's going to slam against some of our best scientific understanding of the world. And of course it's going to lead to harmful intellectual and psychological habits and vices. But is that really all that religion is? And because like you were saying, people will accept dogmatic beliefs about science. People have dogmatic beliefs about all sorts of things. And people in non-religious ways adopt a whole host of supernatural beliefs and stuff. So it doesn't seem like that's the territory of religion. So if we want to adopt a more charitable attitude toward religion and find ways which even non-religious people are entangled with the projects of religious people, then I think that that's a really meaningful definition of it. And really, in practice, when you look at what religious people are up to, the overwhelming majority of it does have something to do with projects of meaning making,
And
community and
like,
traditions.
and ultimately, what are our goals as society? Like, is it just to have a bunch more information, or is it about more than that? Is it about community building and understanding other humans and tying together and sewing together our cosmic patchwork? Like,
Nice.
what are the goals? And
Yeah.
I think that those are really important questions, because even if you're in a situation where you're talking with someone with a dogmatic belief, in that we know enough about humans and human nature to know that it's most likely not going to change in an argument, right? We don't actually get persuaded by logic and argument. We actually get persuaded by story and connection with other people. So what is our role in our conversations in order to all achieve what we're trying to achieve, which seems to be a better place for all of us?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I've gone through the motions of seeing religion as kind of this, not only dogmatism, but as the adopting of a set of certain kinds of beliefs. And those beliefs tend to be pretty, from my perspective, pretty silly and easy to be dismissive of, like young earth creationism. The earth is 6,000 years old. That doesn't seem inherently connected to a project of meaning making. That seems to be a metaphysical claim, a system of beliefs about the world that are stupid and like the contradicting of all of our scientific evidence, and therefore easy for me to be like, that's dumb. Why would people believe that? Easy target. But if I challenge myself to not merely see religion as these sets of beliefs about the world, but as processes, as ways of being in the world that are geared toward meaning making, then it reframes my perspective on things like young earth creationism and religion more generally. And it functions for me as a source of connection and compassion and ways for me to see myself in them and what they're doing, which, like you're saying, that that adheres to, I think, our collective goals as humans, generally speaking.
Sure. Well, Nick, I love your heart, and it's always so good talking to you.
It's always so good talking to you, Dan. I love your heart too.
I hope you have a good rest of your week.
You too, buddy. Talk soon.